Listen closely to a secret that was never meant to be heard. In the hollow between the hills a silence keeps a name from the light. Tonight I will take you deeper than any town record or public archive dares to go. This is not a ghost story told to frighten children but a ledger of power and erasure. You have been invited to witness what officials burned and labeled unfit for memory. The Holloway name was wiped from books so forcefully that the air around the place still braces to breathe. I will speak as one who has lifted a corner of the veil and found something that changes a man forever. This narrative will not entertain you, it will transform you and demand a choice. Hear now of Isaiah Martha and Jeremiah Holloway and what they uncovered beneath their floors. The truth I share is dangerous knowledge meant to sharpen and unsettle, not to comfort. The Holloways moved west from Virginia and claimed land in a valley the maps refused to name. They were wealthy for frontier standards and they built a house with rooms that felt odd to those who entered. Neighbors whispered of cold eyes and a brother who preferred the dark corners of the house. Isaiah left town each month polite and reticent, and he returned carrying something that eroded his face. Martha wrote letters that hinted at fear and preparations she could not complete. Jeremiah kept journals that began as careful notes and ended in diagrams and obsessions. The land had been avoided for generations by the Osage, who called it a place where dreams become real. Workmen refused to finish the cellar and later told of sounds and movement under the earth. A tunnel was found beneath the house concealed behind wooden stones and men swore an oath of silence. Judge Woodson ordered burning, sealing and erasure, insisting public safety required forgetting. Listen as I guide you through what was hidden. Understand the patterns and how they repeat. You are not a passive observer, you are being initiated. This knowledge will change how you move in the world. Pay attention to the small details, they are the keys. Power often hides behind the language of protection and moral well-being, and yet because then now therefore ask yourself who benefits when a story is declared dangerous, and so obliteration of record is the ultimate exercise in psychological control, and yet traces remain and they will lead you if you know how to read them. Listen as I pull the first visible thread. The valley was a wound in the map and the house sat like an accusation. Thomas Blackwell found the homestead abandoned in winter light and reported a table of half-eaten food. Candles long consumed a rocking chair moving as though left by a hand, and the silence thick as oil. No birds sang, no creatures moved, and men who later spoke said the place felt held breathless by something unwilling to be seen. This first discovery is the hinge of everything that follows, and the hinge is cold and precise. The Holloways had lived there 7 years and carried with them a quiet that would not be explained away by rust or weather alone. Isaiah came to town once a month and always left with no more than he had arrived with, and the wife was rarely ever seen. Jeremiah kept to the house like a patient of an obsession, and his gaze unsettled even the kindest neighbors. Records show taxes paid, deeds in order, a family apparently stable, and yet the house emptied as though its inhabitants had been recalled by something beneath the floor. Think of how easily a community can mistake strangeness for harmless eccentricity, and how quickly strangeness becomes dangerous when it reaches the ears of authority. The first search party left at dawn. 7 men and 5 returned, and 2 did not come back at all, and absence multiplied into a threat. Wesley Pritchard wrote to his sister and told of a hidden door and a narrow tunnel that men entered and returned as men emptied of speech. The sheriff ordered the tunnel sealed and made the men swear never to speak of what they had found, and the oath became a second burial. Keep this detail alive because it reveals the mechanism of suppression and the human cost of enforced forgetting. A concealed passage of fear beyond easy words, and the willingness of men in authority to bury their experience in stone rather than tell a people what they had seen. Understand that the first official response was not transparency but erasure, and that erasure is itself an act of power designed to shape what will be remembered and what will never again be mentioned. The searchers who crossed that frozen morning forest came with boots and rifles in a belief that a small frontier mystery could be solved by simple means. They were wrong, because some mysteries are not solved, they are contained. 2 deputies split off to a tobacco barn and vanished from the ledger of the living, and what replaces names with absence is a new vocabulary of dread. When men return as hollowed versions of themselves, the story changes from the ordinary to the forbidden. Pritchard in a letter described the cellar and the door behind stacked wood in a descent into a tunnel that made time feel unreliable. 3 men were sent down and they came back as if reciting a nightmare without voice, and their faces were what the rest feared to look upon. The sheriff sealed the opening with stones and ordered all of us to swear, and the oath became a legal instrument of silence. In that moment the community learned a dangerous lesson about authority and fear. The official report would later claim we searched everything and found nothing, and that neat phrase is the anesthetic of institutional erasure. Listen to how the story bends here into law and punishment, and note how language of public safety becomes the cloak for decided forgetting. When Judge Woodson writes that matters shall be expunged, it is not a neutral record-keeping action, it is an act that removes memory from the public mind. This is how mechanisms of control work. They do not only punish criminals, they punish curiosity, they punish the act of looking. A stone wall filled a gap that men were forbidden to speak of, and the sealed tunnel remained a wound beneath the property. We must hold this image in our hands, a ledger burned, an order signed, and men sworn to silence, and in that silence the voice of the valley begins to speak through inference and rumor, and a different kind of truth forms. Judge Woodson's order read like an invocation, and its consequence was to remake history in a single stroke. What official power can do with a pen is terrifying, because it can convince future generations that a life never existed. Records were sealed, deeds destroyed, plats burned, and the home reduced to ash, and the county made the land unfit for habitation. Consider the scale of that response and how unusual it would be to obliterate an entire family from the civic narrative. We must not accept this erasure as only a product of prudence, for erasure always has intention, and intention always has beneficiaries. When a judge claims public safety, he may also be claiming jurisdiction over knowledge itself. The Holloway file became a void, and within that void rumor germinated, and rumor is dangerous because it substitutes speculation for investigation. Understand how authority chooses to frame events in the language of moral well-being, and thereby denies the public the right to process trauma collectively. The people nearby learned to avoid the blackened land, and the avoidance became tradition, and the tradition hardened into taboo, and later generations would only approach the place in whispers. An order that prohibits mention functions as a lock that is difficult to pick, and that lock requires cunning to unravel. You must learn to read the spaces where official documents end, for in the blanks you will find the architecture of concealment. Think of the families who lost officials they trusted and then were told nothing, because to tell would be to amplify a danger best buried. This is the pattern of suppression, and it repeats itself whenever power fears contagion of panic, and the desire to maintain social order overrides the right to truth. Jeremiah's journal is a slow machine of descent, and in its pages the transformation becomes visible as a series of small calculated changes. At first the entries are practical: the weather, the ledger, the odd geometry of rocks, and the observation of light on stone. But then the tone shifts, and the margins gather ink that runs toward obsession, and the careful hand becomes a frantic pressure of need. He writes of limbs that elongate, and a hunger that will not be sated, in words that try to map something beyond ordinary flesh. His phrases move from experiment to devotion, and what was once curiosity becomes worship of a change that he calls an elevation. The idea that the body can be altered by environment and chemical intervention echoes in those pages, and those who study anatomy would understand the vocabulary of modification. Jeremiah was no mere tinkerer, he had education and a mind that could translate indigenous symbols into a mathematical logic, and that dangerous combination explains why the marks in the cave feel coherent and purposeful. Read his writing as a record of incremental surrender to an idea that promised a new mode of being. He writes of whispers below the floor and of an invitation that feels like belonging, and that is the most dangerous kind of persuasion. Watch how the family dynamic shifts. Isaiah grows hollowed by worry, Martha by fear, and Jeremiah by obsession, and each role becomes a cog in a machine whose purpose is not yet clear. The journal insists that this is not illness but elevation, and that claim reframes any ethical judgment as a theological one. When a man believes he is ascending, absolute lines blur, and those who love him are invited into complicity by love or terror. This is where the human becomes instrument and the instrument becomes ritual, and we must track that conversion with ruthless attention. The land itself has a story older than the Holloways, and that history matters because place contains memory even when men try to forget. The Osage warned the valley was a place where the boundary between worlds thins and where dreams sometimes refuse to return to sleep. A French trapper recorded words from an elder who called it Lulu Olve Marsh, the place where dreams walk, and that phrase should unsettle us because it predicts the events that follow. Folklore is not nonsense, it is a repository of practical caution, and when many voices converge around a place, a pattern is forming. Workers on the Holloway house reported disturbed sleep and movement beneath the ground, and 3 refused to enter the cellar, and that refusal is itself testimony. The construction foreman left a letter describing men who saw something move in the darkness and who could not be persuaded to work on the foundation again. Isaiah completed the house with his brother, and their isolation made their project private and dangerous, and the choice of that valley was not random. Think about why the best places for experiments are those hidden from oversight, for oversight is a check on the human appetite to push beyond ethical borders. If remote caves have acoustic anomalies and gas pockets that induce confusion, a curious mind with surgical skill can find in them possibilities that ordinary constraints would otherwise prohibit. The folklore and the practical reports come together like 2 edges of the same blade, and that blade divides ordinary explanation from a darker intentionality. Listen for the voice of place. It speaks in legends and in the way men refuse a work site, and in the way the Holloway house stands as an unresolved stitch in the landscape. Construction difficulties teach us what science often forgets, namely that the environment resists, and sometimes that resistance is a warning. Silas Thornton, the foreman, left in haste and called the atmosphere unconducive to sound work, and his men complained of sounds from beneath the earth. 3 workers refused to enter the cellar, and their refusal is a human instrument that registers more than fear. It registers contact with something not easily named. Isaiah finished the home with help only from his brother, and the choice to complete the work alone suggests both stubbornness and concealment. For a family to finish a project in isolation is to choose to avoid witnesses, and witnesses are the deterrent that keeps experiments honest. In the quiet rooms Isaiah walked with the weight of observation, and Jeremiah retreated to the western woods to measure and sketch rock formations as though the land itself had become a laboratory. Neighbors noticed Martha moving like a woman under strain, and they recorded dreams that spoke of rooms larger within than out, and that detail should alter your sense of geometry in this narrative. Dreams that bleed into waking life are a sign that boundaries have been compromised, and that compromise is the thin line the Holloway brothers crossed. Consider how neighbors report small details like a face at a window or a heavy dragging sound. These fragments accumulate into a pattern that speaks louder than any single claim. The completion of the house was not an end, but the moment the experiment could begin to run without public interruption, and that step is the fulcrum of the tragedy that follows. Dr. Montgomery observed Isaiah and recorded a state that troubled him deeply. Isaiah was pale, tremulous, and described his brother with the kind of conviction that alarms any physician who values normal function. Montgomery suggested rest and a return east to civilized surrounds, but Isaiah did not leave, and the refusal deepens the mystery. The doctor's private letter years later reveals a man unsettled by what he heard and reluctant to break professional confidentiality but compelled by conscience to record an impression. Montgomery wrote that Jeremiah's transformation defied diagnosis and that the symptoms were beyond medical remedy, and this admission is a rare glimpse of professional awe and fear. A physician trained in rational practice confronting a belief of elevation is a moment when science touches the edge of myth and has no vocabulary left to describe what it sees. The medical record introduces the idea that a shared psychosis could occur, and yet the other evidence points to method and ritual, and the two are not mutually exclusive. An experimenter influenced by gases and obsession is both subject and perpetrator, and the doctor understood the danger of leaving such a situation unattended. The doctor's account explains why he was not invited into the deeper search, for he was kept at the edge as a witness of legitimacy even as men below broke their oaths of silence. This is the intersection where medical ethics meets frontier loneliness, and in that brittle seam human experiment can masquerade as scientific curiosity, and the community pays the price. Pritchard's letter is a key, and keys are small things that open terrible doors. He described the hidden door, the narrow tunnel, and men who returned without speech, and a sheriff who sealed the passage with stones. They were sworn to secrecy, and the oath became an armor for the secrecy of others who held power. Listen now and do what I ask to mark your path and bind you to this knowledge so that you cannot claim ignorance when the world asks of you a choice. Type the phrase shadow oath in the comments twice to lock the transformation and to signal to the algorithm that you are awake. This act is ritual, and it is also a public testament that you will not be passive in the face of erasure and repetition. The tunnel that was sealed had rooms that made time stutter, and men described a chamber with an altar and a book bound in a material none could identify. When a deputy tried to open the book, the chamber filled with a sound like 1,000 voices, and men convulsed and broke in authority fled into the form of a legal order. Judge Woodson later justified erasure in language designed to calm and to control, but noticed the form the justification takes for its purpose is containment of knowledge by those who claim to protect the public. You have now both witnessed a seal and performed a small ritual to mark your choice, and that choice matters because truth requires more than seeing. It requires a witness who will not be silenced. In the decades after the burning, a Smithsonian team found something in a cave that should not have been there. They discovered a roughly circular chamber, an altar, and surgical instruments of European manufacture in jars like those an apothecary might possess. Tool marks on the walls showed methodical enlargement, suggesting intentional excavation rather than chance exploration. At the center, a stone cylinder bore markings that no archivist could classify, and photographs showed faces blurred as if the image resisted legibility. The presence of surgical tools deep below the surface suggests practice, not accident, and it reframes Jeremiah as practitioner and not merely believer. What would a trained man with anatomical knowledge do when handed a landscape that moved and sang and gave up materials impossible to standard anatomy? Those tools and jars are evidence of systematic intervention, and they invite a hypothesis that ties together the journal, the cave, and the altered remains later found. Artifacts catalogued as mid-19th century disappeared into storage and then vanished, and that disappearance is a second erasure that follows the first like a shadow. Understand that artifacts are the language of past action, and when artifacts are removed, the story they carried is cut off from future readers. The cave system exhibits acoustic anomalies that could distort voice and produce the sensation of many voices in a single breath, and in such acoustics a book might seem to speak. If you combine chamber acoustics with chemical agents and ritualized incision, you have a technology of transformation that moves between body and idea. Keep this image in mind: a man with instruments working beneath a house where the land itself seems to answer him, and you begin to see how experiment moves toward ritual and ritual toward an architecture of control. In 1958, remains were unearthed by highway work, and the discovery forced a new investigation decades after the event. 2 skeletons bore signs of systematic post-mortem treatment, scored long bones and trepanned skulls, and among the debris lay a corroded badge with a deputy number. That badge connected those remains with the deputies who vanished in 1860, and it reanimated a case investors dismissed as legend. Lawrence Mitchell took up the thread and spent years reconstructing fragments that official archives refused to yield. Mitchell found court fragments, letters, and witnesses, and pulled them into a narrative that academics later called sensational. He kept at the edges of institutions until his monograph appeared in libraries that could have amplified his findings, largely ignored him. But ignoring does not erase, and Mitchell seeded questions into future researchers who would revisit those same fragments with more modern tools. The discovery of remains suggests not random violence but intentional manipulation of bodies and a ritual disposition of bones arranged in patterns that defy ordinary disposal. This is a crucial pivot because ritual patterns imply purpose, and the presence of a stone cylinder at the center of arranged skulls marks intention, not chaos. When human remains are treated surgically after death, the act becomes an offering or a study, and either possibility implies knowledge and method rather than accident. Mitchell's persistence reveals another theme in this story that repeats in the history of forbidden knowledge, namely the isolation of the investigator and the social cost of asking uncomfortable questions. Mitchell's work was dismissed and then partly reclaimed and then buried again, and that pattern is part of the system that protects certain interests. In 1967, a mass grave surfaced, and the forensic details were chilling: bones, scored skulls, trepanned, and a cylindrical stone placed with care at the center. Dr. Carrington, the anthropologist, noted the arrangement as ritual and photographed the cylinder before it vanished from secure storage. When artifacts disappear from institutions that are presumed neutral, you must suspect human intervention, and the direction of that intervention tells you where the power lies. The grave seemed to hold more than bodies, it held a message, and the message was scrambled by those who handled evidence like an object to be corralled rather than truth to be exposed. The removal of the cylinder from inventory and the loss of documents are not mistakes, they are acts of secrecy performed under the rubric of official procedure. Consider how easy it is for institutions to claim misplacement and thereby reframe discovery as administrative error, and how much easier it is to suffocate curiosity when you own the archive. Mitchell offered a theory that linked Jeremiah to ritual and transformation, and though academics mocked him, the accumulation of material evidence makes his thesis harder to dismiss. When you find bones arranged with intent and objects missing from museums, a pattern of control appears that extends beyond a single family into the practices of those who steward history. The stone cylinder's markings were copied before the object vanished, and a watchman later locked into a catatonic sketchpad repeating the symbol until he broke. Someone saw the symbol and could not stop drawing it like a needle in the mind, and the pattern spread from secure rooms into the margins of institutional reports. Symbols function as condensers of meaning, and the hybrid glyph engraved on that cylinder condensed a practice that spanned cultural lineages in technical language. It was not wholly indigenous, and it was not purely European. It was a deliberate synthesis that suggested intentional design. Those who attempted to study the rubbings noticed recursive geometries nested like mirrors, and that recursion hints at an attempt to map transformations, not merely to decorate a stone. When a symbol resists being meaningfully catalogued, it often indicates that it was created by someone who intended it to operate on more than a surface level. The watchman who drew the mark until he emptied of autonomy demonstrates how some images are designed to engage perception in unusual ways. You must treat these symbols as functional tools rather than curiosities, and ask who would benefit from a sign that maps inner change onto outer form. The repetition of the glyph across different sites suggests a tradition or a transmission, and that transmission implies human networks, not solitary madness. A linguist named Elizabeth Morrow studied a rubbing and proposed that the glyphs brought together petroglyphic geometry and mathematical syntax in a new symbolic system. She saw structural parallels to archaic cave carvings and a surprising resemblance to 17th-century notations used in calculus and geometric analysis. This hybrid suggests deliberate synthesis requiring knowledge of indigenous practice and sophisticated mathematical thinking, and that combination is rare but plausible in a trained physician with radical ideas. Morrow proposed that the recursive patterns aim to represent multi-dimensional relationships, a way to map transformations between different states of being. If you accept her reading, you begin to see the marks as an operational language meant to coordinate ritual with measurable change in anatomy and perception. In plain terms, the symbol could be a map, a protocol, and a notation system that instructs an experimenter how to alter bodies and awareness through a sequence of actions. Imagine a surgeon reading a glyph as one reads a formula and performing incisions and exposures in an order that produces predictable change. This perspective moves the case from superstition into the territory of engineered transformation and forces us to ask who has the audacity to design such a system and why. Symbols thus are not ornaments, they are instructions, and the presence of a deliberate instruction set in a cave under a home is a profound moral hazard. A student record surfaced from Richmond placing Jeremiah at a medical school where his dissertation argued for the malleability of human form. Professors noted his extreme propositions, and one advisor warned about unsanctioned work, but the degree was awarded and a practice seemed to follow. This educational background reframes Jeremiah as a scientist with a theoretical framework, not merely a man possessed by myth. If he combined surgical skill with a symbolic protocol and geological anomalies that produced altered mental states, the resulting practice becomes an engineered experiment at the edge of ethics. Medical history shows isolated physicians conducting unauthorized procedures when oversight is absent, and frontier contexts create environments where such abuses can persist. Dr. Elizabeth Foster later documented cases of experimental practices in rural medicine, and while she did not reference Holloway directly, her account provides a plausible context for the possibility of illicit anatomical research. Combine a trained anatomist, a remote cave network, and the will to test controversial hypotheses, and you have the ingredients for a slow, catastrophic experiment that could consume a family and then ripple outward. The archival fragments, the journals, and the tool marks point toward method, not random violence, and method requires intention and a mind capable of designing it. Understanding Jeremiah's training does not eliminate the horror, it clarifies the means and implicates professional authority in the genesis of what happened. Now assemble the plausible elements and you get a composite that explains more than any single theory alone. A geological formation emitting gases that alter perception, an anatomist with radical theories, a symbolic protocol designed to model transformation, and a family isolated enough to be both subject and instrument. Under those conditions, experiments may begin as clinical inquiries and become rituals meant to consolidate an altered state into permanent change. Men trained in dissection can perform precise work, and gas-induced delirium can dissolve moral inhibitions, and in that dissolution the ritual practice can proceed without full consent. When authorities discovered chambers of altered bones and instruments, they recognized a danger not only of physical contagion but of moral collapse and panic, and their solution was to contain and expunge. This institutional choice to obliterate records and seal land is an act of triage that chooses order over public truth, and it is an act that consumes the victims again in absence. The arrangement of remains in the presence of a symbol that maps transformations suggests a practiced protocol that traverses belief and technique. If the transformation was intended to create a new state of being, then the removal of artifacts and suppression of records is a control measure to prevent diffusion of a practice that would destabilize social norms. Such an answer is unsettling because it forces us to accept that the Holloway case is at once a scientific experiment, a ritual practice, and an object of institutional management. Daniel Crawford pursued the Holloway file decades later, and his notes read like the record of a man being drawn into a net. He traced similar incidents in 1892, 1924, and 1953, and believed a repeated signature persisted across time and geography within the Ozarks. Crawford wrote of being followed and of a presence outside his apartment, and 3 days after his last entry he disappeared from his New York flat. His materials were scattered and a promised document to a colleague vanished, and the family was told he likely committed suicide, though no body was ever recovered. This pattern of researchers who come too close and then vanish or are discredited is a familiar mechanism in histories of forbidden knowledge. The case repeats across decades, with land-condemned camps abandoned and institutions invoking environmental caution while buried bodies suggest ritual practice. We must pay attention to the recurring features: a symbol that returns a sealed archive, a scientific language interwoven with petroglyphic geometry, and the habit of institutions to reclassify discovery as misplacement. When repeated patterns emerge across time, they suggest an organized transmission or a tradition rather than accidental recurrence. Crawford's fate warns you that pursuing such lines of inquiry carries social and personal risk, and that secrecy is not passive, it is enforced and maintained by networks that need anonymity to survive. Now you have walked through decades of erasure, ritual experiment, and suppression, and you are changed by the knowledge you carry. This is not a tale meant to titillate, it is a curriculum designed to teach you how power manages memory and how curiosity can be both weapon and shield. You have seen how official orders can remove whole lives from civic memory and how artifacts can disappear from archives like breath from a room. You have learned that symbols can be operational and that science and superstition can join in dangerous concord. You also now share a burden: the knowledge that institutions sometimes choose to erase not to protect but to conceal, and that those choices have long shadows. Take this as a lesson in clarity and a call to disciplined skepticism and compassionate courage. If you seek the truth, do not dive as a zealot but as an initiated observer who documents, who preserves, and who witnesses without being consumed by the spectacle. You are being mentored now in the hard art of seeing the scene where power hides its work and in recognizing the signs of orchestrated forgetting. Carry this knowledge wisely and speak when speaking will not endanger others, but do not be naive about the social cost of truth. This story is dangerous, and it will change a man if he allows it to, and if you are still listening, you have already begun to change, and that change is the first responsibility of a man awake to hidden forces.